Nuremberg, July 1946. Senior Nazi leaders stand trial in the first war crimes tribunal in history. Soviet prosecutor, Lieutenant General R.A. Rudenko, questions witnesses about a massacre of tens of thousands of Polish military officers and civilians found in mass graves in a forest in Eastern Europe. As Rudenko builds the case for German responsibility for the massacre, the charges are dismissed at British and American insistence. The tension between the supposed allies is palpable. For in this courtroom, truth and justice are not the only agendas. Amidst all the terrible crimes attributed to the Nazis, why is the massacre of thousands of Poles in the Katyn forest abandoned? Is it for lack of evidence? Or is there something far darker at play? The horror that was World War II was unprecedented in human history. Tens of millions died on the battlefield, and in appalling atrocities. But out of the chaos and suffering, the victorious Allies sought justice for those who had been wronged, in the hope of preventing such crimes from ever being committed again. In pursuing the guilty and exposing the truth, who would be held to account? And who would escape justice? Compromised by politics and the desire for revenge, the pursuit of justice was imperfect. Yet these trials redefined international law and shaped the modern world. This is World War II History on Trial. In the wake of the unspeakable crimes of the Second World War, the Nuremberg trial promised a new moral order. But the high-minded pursuit of justice was only one objective of those present.
In ideal world, trial is about seeking justice and about uncovering truth. But of course, we do not live in an ideal world. And every trial has a political component, whether we talk about totalitarian societies or more democratic societies.
At Nuremberg and beyond, the truth was subject to manipulation and weaponization, as nations sought to control their narrative of the war.
The relationship between trials and truth have been very complex. Partly the problem is that it's not so much what the trials themselves decided and negotiated, it's more about what kinds of narratives about those trials have permeated society.
Propaganda, truth, and justice are innately related in a triangle, and I think the whole legacy of the Second World War is in this triangle between propagandistic use, sometimes of the truth, and the need to get legal recognition for what happened.
And at Nuremberg, this legacy began with Soviet attempts to rewrite history and weaponize the Katyn Massacre. April 1943. In the Katyn forest, deep in occupied territory, following their invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, a mass grave is discovered by German forces. Teams of workers grimly exhume the remains of thousands of Polish officers and intellectuals. These graves are part of a story that the Soviet Union would prefer remained buried.
Von Ribbentrop, leaving Berlin for Moscow, ushers in a new, incomprehensible chapter in German diplomacy.
At the start of the Second World War, there is a non-aggression pact between Stalin and Hitler.
They promised not to attack each other, but they also agreed to both attack Poland. So when Germany launches the Second World War by invading Poland, shortly thereafter, the Soviet Union invades Poland from the other direction.
Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939. 2 weeks later, on the 17th, the Red Army stormed in from the east. On September 22nd, at the Polish city of Brest-Litovsk, the Soviets and Germans celebrate the partition of Poland with a joint parade. Germany now occupies western and central Poland, and the Soviets, the east.
When the Soviet Union takes over this eastern part, it installs a very strong repression of Polish opposition, Polish intellectuals, Polish civil servants, especially Polish officers.
As part of this repression, in May 1940, the Soviets deported and executed some 20,000 Polish officers and intellectuals, burying the evidence of their crimes at a series of mass graves across the USSR, one of which was in the Katyn forest. Then, in June 1941, Hitler stabbed Stalin in the back by ordering his forces to invade the Soviet Union. After suffering numerous, crushing defeats at the hands of the Germans, Stalin turned to the West for help. In late 1941, despite protests from the Polish government in exile, the Allies agreed. It was an uneasy alliance, forged out of necessity. And necessity dictated that the West make a deal with the devil. Following 2 years of brutal fighting, in 1943, advancing Nazi forces discovered the mass grave at Katyn and seized on the opportunity to drive a wedge between the Allies.
Germans started to disseminate information about mass killing of Polish officers in Katyn forest, and it really damaged the reputation of the Soviet Union.
They will bring people from all occupied countries to the Katyn forest to show the mass grave and to show how evil the Soviet Union is.
But the Soviets used the fog of war to push their own narrative.
The reaction of the Soviet Union is, this is Nazi propaganda. It's the Nazis who have butchered these Poles. It's not us.
Soviets organized commission which stated that the crime was committed by Germans, so they falsified evidence, they falsified basically everything in Katyn forest.
Behind closed doors, the leaders in the West knew the Soviets were lying, but they chose to suppress the evidence rather than risk alienating an important ally. But this did not mean they needed to cooperate with the Soviets once the war was won. Fearful that the Western Allies would exclude them from pursuing justice together post-war, the Soviets needed a way to show they were reliable. And as their fortunes on the battlefield improved, an opportunity presented itself.
Now comes great news of the Soviet offensive. Not only has Russia withstood the power of at least 240 divisions brought against her, but she's switched over to the attack on a large scale.
December 42, January 43, the Red Army is pushing back the Germans, and the retreating Germans leave behind terrible scenes of atrocities, mass graves all over.
The Germans called the war in the East Vernichtungskrieg, a war of annihilation. Ordered to ignore the rules of warfare by their leaders, the German military would kill as many as 27 million Soviet citizens and soldiers. Entire villages erased, yawning mass graves, and of course, liberated death camps. The evidence of Hitler's war of annihilation was everywhere. And the Soviets wanted to show the world these horrors.
So this is the moment in 1943 where each Red Army Corps has a cinematographic team with clear instructions to film mass graves and scenes of atrocities. We are shooting this footage, we have the images, we circulate it, and then we organize trials. So this is propaganda, but it is also truth. And so the judicial process in the heat of war becomes part of the general logistics of war.
Prior to the revelations of the Katyn Massacre, the Soviets had only conducted closed trials of Nazis and collaborators. But from July 1943, hoping to redirect attention onto Nazi atrocities, they began holding open trials. And the first internationally significant open trial began in the Ukrainian city of Kharkiv on December 15th, 1943. Soviet and international media were invited to attend so that the world could witness the strength and moral conviction of the Soviet regime.
It was the first trial in the world where Nazi perpetrators were defendants. It was also a clear message showing that the Soviet Union is willing to organize this trial of Nazi perpetrators.
At Kharkiv, 4 men faced a Soviet military court. All were charged with war crimes. The 3 German officers were accused of murdering thousands of Soviets in gas cars, primitive mobile gas chambers, and by firing squad. Soviet collaborator Mikhail Bulanov was accused of driving the vans. The organizers of the Kharkiv trial were more concerned with sending a message than in following due legal process.
They were completely staged, so everyone knew what to say during open court session. It does not mean, however, that these crimes were not committed. So they were reliable in a sense that witnesses really saw these crimes. Majority of defendants on this open Soviet war crimes trials, they were really complicit in the crimes they were accused of. So here we talk about real crimes, real perpetrators, in majority of cases about real witnesses and about real facts. And evidence was huge because the scale of violence on Soviet-occupied territories was huge.
All 4 defendants were found guilty and executed by public hanging on the 19th of December. Only 4 days after the trial had begun. The media coverage at Kharkiv proved to be a propaganda coup for the Soviet authorities. And Soviet newspapers trumpeted the beginning of the great and terrible trial of all Germans who have transgressed human laws. The Soviet Union continued with large public trials throughout the war and in its immediate aftermath. These open trials served a dual purpose, showcasing the crimes of the Nazi regime and as a performance for Western eyes.
The Soviet Union wanted to demonstrate to Western countries that Soviet Union is going to carry out this justice. Because there were still negotiations between the Soviet Union and Western countries how to organize trial of Nazi perpetrators and whether they actually should organize this trial.
And it worked, as the Allies agreed to proceed with the Nuremberg experiment. But once again, the Soviets would attempt to weaponize the truth of the Katyn Massacre.
Insidiously, the Soviet Union will bring the charge that Katyn was a Nazi crime into the accusations of the Nuremberg Tribunal.
The Soviets presented their falsified evidence and brought to the stand 3 witnesses to testify. Although the Western judges listened to the evidence, doubts about the veracity of Soviet claims loomed.
They were very cautious about documents and witnesses provided by the Soviet Union because, of course, it was clear that there was partial falsification of evidence.
If the Soviets were willing to falsify evidence of Katyn, was the rest of their evidence against the defendants suspect? The Western Allies were walking a tightrope. They were desperate to preserve the integrity of the tribunal, but could not risk alienating the Soviets and threaten the spirit of international cooperation that Nuremberg represented.
In the end, because of the tensions between the Soviet delegation, the French, British, and American delegation, no judgment is made over Katyn. But it might well have happened that the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg pronounced the wrong judgment, saying that the Nazis did it, in which case its moral legacy would have been obliterated. And so the suspicion of Soviet bad faith is one of the legacies of the Katyn lie.
It would take almost 5 decades for the Soviets to admit the truth of what occurred at Katyn. In 1990, the Soviet Union, under Mikhail Gorbachev, adopted a policy of openness, which demanded a frank reassessment of Soviet history in the hopes of appeasing their satellite states, like Poland, who had been victimized under the Soviet regime. At Nuremberg, the Soviets used the international trials to bolster a politically useful narrative, one where their own crimes were erased and all guilt lay with the enemy. And across post-war Europe, others followed suit.
In many ways, remembering the trials is really remembering the stories that we tell ourselves about who was innocent, who was guilty, who was on the right side of history. Certainly, in the case of the Balkans, the trials of World War II remained a very sore point for a lot of people throughout the 20th century.
Following the Nazi invasion of Yugoslavia in 1941, a brutal struggle erupted against the invading Nazi forces and among the country's deeply divided ethnic groups. Serbs, Croats, Bosniaks, and others formed rival factions, some resisting the Axis, others collaborating, and each pursuing their own vision for Yugoslavia's future.
The best way to understand the complexity of World War II in the former Yugoslavia is that it was, of course, World War II as a global war, but then within it, an ethnic civil war between mostly 3 distinct groups. Croats very quickly formed their own independent fascist regime, ran by the Ustasha group, and they created their own independent state of Croatia. A lot of Serbs joined communist partisans under Josip Broz Tito and fought the Nazis on the side of the Allies, mostly in pursuit of some kind of a communist utopia. A lot of Serbs joined the Chetniks. They were very anti-communist, very Serb nationalist, and initially quite royalists.
The result was a complex and violent conflict, blending foreign occupation with civil war.
So you had these different groups that were different times allied with either the Allies or the Axis powers, and some of those alliances shifted. So the Chetniks initially had support of the West and the Allied forces, especially Winston Churchill. This is not necessarily because the West liked Chetniks or Draža Mihailović, but because they were anti-communist.
Draža Mihailović was leader of the Yugoslav army in the fatherland, or JVO. They formed part of the Chetniks. In late 1941, Britain recognized Mihailović and the Chetniks as the official resistance in Yugoslavia. But this relationship quickly soured.
Around 1943, certainly by 1944, the West withdrew any support from the Chetniks and realized that they're actually working with the Nazis.
Mihailović's men worked with the Italian occupiers and at times cooperated with the Wehrmacht to fight for what the Chetniks called the creation of a great Yugoslavia and within it of a great Serbia, which is to be ethnically pure. Although the figures are contested, over the course of the war, as many as 33,000 Muslims and 32,000 Croats were murdered by the Chetniks in ethnically motivated massacres.
Chetniks also committed, especially later in the war, a lot of horrific crimes against humanity and war crimes against civilians, mostly Bosnian Muslim civilians, some Croat civilians, but also a lot of crimes against supporters of the partisans.
For these acts, there would be a reckoning. In 1944, the Soviet Red Army, aided by the partisans, liberated Yugoslavia, and Josip Broz Tito emerged as its leader. Seeking to unite the battered and divided nation under the banner of the new communist regime, Tito sought to solidify his rule by purging his former rivals. Thousands of anti-communists were arrested and tried as traitors and war criminals.
It was very important for the communist Yugoslav leadership to put these people on trial, the leaders of Chetniks and then leaders of Ustasha on the Croatian side, to create a clean break with the past and to present to the population this new communist narrative.
And the centerpiece of Tito's political purge was the trial of Draža Mihailović.
In Belgrade, scenes reminiscent of the trial of war criminals at Nuremberg have been witnessed in recent weeks. All passes were strictly checked, and the courtroom was packed with those permitted to attend the trial of a number of Yugoslavs accused of complicity with the Germans.
On June 10, 1946, Mihailović faced a military tribunal alongside 23 other defendants. The indictment alleged that Mihailović was a traitor that had obstructed Tito and his supporters and collaborated with the Axis forces during the occupation. Mihailović's personal records, photographs and documents were important evidence. Numerous witness testimonies also pointed to his culpability. He was found guilty on 47 counts, including high treason and war crimes.
It was very clear that the Yugoslav communists were going to convict Mihailović and many others as enemies of the state, as collaborators. There was no question about that, and it's not as if he was given serious defense opportunities.
On July 15, 1946, Draža Mihailović was sentenced to death by firing squad. The trial of Mihailović and Tito's political purge helped solidify his control over the fragile, multi-ethnic patchwork of Yugoslavia. Over the decades, Tito maintained control by promoting a narrative of a shared Yugoslav identity that rose above ethnic divisions. But beneath the unity lay deep-seated tensions that never truly disappeared.
A lot of people were swept up in these post-World War II collaborationist trials, and that created a lot of resentment amongst the population, especially those who were not affiliated with the Communist Party. That then came up to the surface as soon as communism ended in the 1990s.
The War of Yugoslav Succession began in 1991 and would last until 2001. During this conflict, the ethnic violence between Serbs, Croats and Bosniaks erupted once again. The war showed Tito's story of a shared identity through brotherhood and unity to be a lie. Many Serbs turned to the past for a new national narrative, recasting figures once condemned by the former regime.
Throughout the communist period, Mihailović was considered a war criminal, a collaborationist, somebody who has ordered or commanded over horrible war crimes. After the wars of the 1990s ended and Yugoslavia was no more, one of the central mythologies of this new Serbian political narrative was the mythology of the Chetniks.
In 2015, in the now independent state of Serbia, the Supreme Court rehabilitated Mihailović, nullifying his conviction from 1946.
And this is a very stunning historical reversal because the court basically said that nothing from that early communist trial should be kept on record, that there's no evidence, no testimony that was heard then that should be valid.
In Serbia today, Draža Mihailovic's legacy remains contentious. For some, he is a national hero. For others, a traitor and war criminal. The political motives of Tito's regime in prosecuting anti-communists provided a convenient opportunity for some Serbs to rewrite the story of the Second World War. But narratives of right and wrong, of heroes and villains, rarely fit neatly into a framework of truth and justice, as was seen in one trial in Manila in 1945.
The recapture of Manila wasn't effected without large areas of the city being devastated by the battle itself and by wanton destruction caused by the enemy.
February 3rd, 1945. US and Japanese forces are engaged in one of the most destructive urban battles in history. An estimated 100,000 civilians were killed during the intense street-to-street fighting as the Japanese defended Manila with fanatic zeal. When General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific area, finally declared victory on March 3rd, what was revealed was a massacre that had few equals in the war.
That was a very atrocity-laden combat. It went on for a long time. It was urban combat, and there seems to be no question but that Japanese troops committed crimes against not only service members but also civilians.
Without hope for escape, the Japanese had vented their rage on the local population in what would come to be known as the Rape of Manila. For this, the US was determined there would be a reckoning for those responsible come war's end.
Tomoyuki Yamashita was one of the leading Japanese generals toward the end of the war, and in the last months of the war, he was the leading officer in the Philippines.
Captured in 1945, the case against Yamashita would center on what occurred in Manila, with the indictment against him alleging a deliberate plan to massacre and exterminate a large part of the civilian population of Batangas province, as a result of which more than 25,000 men, women, and children, all unarmed, non-combatant civilians, were brutally mistreated and killed.
In war-ravaged Manila, the first Pacific War Crimes trial. The former Japanese commander in the Philippines is charged with responsibility for wholesale rape and murder by his forces during the last days of Manila.
Yamashita's trial began on October 29th, 1945. The prosecution presented reams of evidence, including the testimonies of 286 witnesses who recounted stories of men, women, and children being assaulted, tortured, poisoned, mutilated, and murdered. But tying these atrocities directly to Yamashita would prove a difficult task.
The central concern of Yamashita is that there is no evidence that he himself ever laid a finger on anybody.
They weren't making the case of Yamashita ordering or authorizing the commission of war crimes necessarily, but they were trying to show that he should have known what was going on.
And this was where Yamashita's culpability for the rape of Manila becomes clouded. During the fighting, Yamashita was some 200 kilometers away. On top of that, he had specifically given orders to Rear Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi to withdraw before the US arrived. Iwabuchi ignored these orders, choosing instead to fight to the death.
Because of the superior fighting capabilities of the American forces, Yamashita's forces were not able to maintain the kind of organizational structure it should in order to protect the commander's ability to control his subordinate forces.
Did you know of any mistreatment of the civilian population in Manila?
マニラの住民に対する虐待ということは知りません。
I knew nothing about mistreatment of civilians in Manila.
His defense was, our communications was a shambles. I had no idea what was going on. And to the extent I did, I had absolutely no ability to do anything about it.
But the court chose to ignore these facts.
The commission finds you guilty as charged and sentences you to death by hanging.
The problem was that his charge simply said, you were the boss, they were the troops, they committed crimes, you're guilty.
Yamashita was sentenced to death on December 7th, 1945, the 4th anniversary of the bombing of Pearl Harbor.
The very fact that they allowed the verdict to come down on that date really strengthened this impression that it was a hasty, preconceived trial.
Although Yamashita's soldiers had visited brutal reprisals in other instances on civilians, and the widespread mistreatment of POWs by the Japanese was well documented, the particulars of his case have left many to speculate at its motives.
The general understanding is that Yamashita was singled out because General MacArthur wanted retribution. He was in custody of the US Army, which meant that he would be prosecuted at a US military commission. The fact that Yamashita was convicted on a very weak case should lead us to think that there is a political dimension in his conviction. And MacArthur's influence is something to consider absolutely.
Did MacArthur seek retribution and use his power to subvert justice? Was a wholly US-administered tribunal capable of conducting a fair trial when the dust of battle was still settling? Time may never tell. What is certain is that the trial of Yamashita has led some historians to argue that the post-war prosecution of Japanese war criminals was simply victor's justice. And this accusation is reinforced by the colonial power's manipulation of the post-war justice program.
Good news of a different kind comes from Hong Kong, where they've been rounding up Japanese war criminals. It's just possible that even if they haven't got a guilty conscience, at least they know they haven't much to look forward to.
Yamashita's trial was the first of thousands of trials held by the Allies across Southeast Asia.
According to the Japanese data, more than 2,200 trials are held against some 5,700 individuals at 51 separate locations across Asia and Pacific.
Unlike the high-profile, internationally administered Tokyo Tribunal, which began in 1946 and prosecuted 28 of the senior Japanese leadership, these trials would prosecute those of lower rank and be run by individual nations. From China to Indonesia, from India to the Philippines, roughly 4,600 individuals were found guilty, with roughly 920 sentenced to death and executed.
The charges against the accused are mainly that of war crimes and not the planning and waging of aggression, which was set aside as a case to be made at Tokyo. The accused varied. Some really at the top in the Army and Navy organizations, and some at the very bottom.
At these trials, the Allies were keen to prosecute the Japanese for their mistreatment of prisoners of war and civilians during their conquest of Southeast Asia. But the actions of some of the colonial powers in the region was at odds with their expressed commitment to the embryonic field of international law.
Batavia has been the center of the Indonesian nationalist movement. The leader of the movement is Dr. Sukarno. Mass meetings at many places in Java and Sumatra called upon the people to present a united front to the Dutch and their allies.
In 1946, 1947, 1948, the Dutch army is combating an insurgency in Indonesia. The French army is combating an insurgency in Indochina. The British are facing multiple insurgencies.
And the likelihood that their acts of violence may have involved instances of war crimes certainly undercut the legitimacy of the war crimes trials being carried out by these authorities against the Japanese.
Hundreds of thousands of people were killed as the colonial nations employed torture, mass executions, reprisal operations, and even forced deportations to put down resistance from independence fighters. All while the colonial powers were simultaneously seeking justice for their own resistance groups who had suffered at the hands of Japanese and Nazi war criminals.
The standard defense is we were dealing with terrorists. And what do you deal with terrorists? You judge them and you shoot them. And of course, the former resistance fighters said, no, we are not terrorists. We put up a legitimate fight. And so there was an intense debate initiated by former resistors saying, well, people like us in the future deserve legal protection. You cannot simply declare they are terrorists and they can be shot.
The calls for legal protection by Allied resistance groups sparked a debate at the United Nations to expand the Geneva Conventions and define exactly what constitutes a legal resistance movement.
It's especially the Danish delegation that says, well, we all agree that a war of aggression is illegitimate. Since the invasion is illegitimate, any resistance against an illegitimate invasion is per se legitimate. This triggers a very strong defensive reaction by all colonial powers.
The colonial powers were fearful that this definition was too broad and could be used to prosecute their actions in the colonies. And so the colonial powers put their fingers on the scale.
And they say that we understand that retroactively we protect our national resistance, but we are providing an instrument for the future. So we had very lengthy discussions where they said, well, we are thinking about ways to offer legal protection to the resistance that happened in the Second World War, but that would not be applicable to insurgents in the colonies.
When the Geneva Conventions were amended in 1949, the colonial powers ensured that the legal definition of legitimate resistance was extremely narrow.
Insurgents can be recognized if they carry their weapons openly, if they carry a distinctive sign, if they have effective central command, and if there are effective lines of communication between the central command and local forces. All sorts of additional conditions which would partially apply to the resistance during the Second World War, but not to the Viet Cong.
In Southeast Asia, justice had been bent to serve the interests of fading empires, punishing some while shielding others. The colonial powers had weaponized the law to serve their own ends and compromised the promise of no impunity given at Nuremberg. And this was far from the only time that the pursuit of justice was sacrificed for political expediency. For in the shadow cast by the Second World War, a new conflict was emerging. One where the ally of yesterday was the enemy of tomorrow.
Cut off from the rest of the other western zones of Germany by the Russian blockade, the western zones of Berlin were threatened with hunger and worse. There was only one way open to the beleaguered capital, by air.
By 1948, barely a few years since the fall of the Third Reich, the foundations of the Berlin Wall were settling.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent.
In the brewing Cold War, the idealism found at Nuremberg seemed to be slipping further away.
We have various stakeholders, and various people want different things from conquered Germany. We have international lawyers who are trying to build an effective regime of international criminal law. We also have people trying to reconstruct the German state to be a democratic state. The Soviets have very different plans for what they're going to do with their zone of occupation. Americans suddenly start thinking, well, who's our main enemy here? A defeated Germany or a Soviet Union, which is now basically controlling all of Eastern Europe?
Nazi generals were enlisted to advise the US on Soviet military tactics. Secret police, Gestapo, and intelligence service agents could offer insights into Soviet capabilities. And engineers and scientists divulged the secrets of some of the most advanced weapons created by the Third Reich. Among these individuals were wanted Nazi criminals. Criminals who authorities were even now trying to locate. Many would evade justice, at least for a time, as nations chose to shield them from prosecution, hoping their experience would be of some value in the Cold War. And one of the most cynical of these arrangements made by the US was with former Gestapo chief Klaus Barbie.
Barbie was this so-called butcher of Lyon. He was the head of the Gestapo in Lyon. He's German, not French. And he basically was responsible for the torture and killing of resistance fighters, and also for making sure that Jews were being deported from the area.
Barbie was responsible for the deaths of over 4,000 people and the deportation of at least 7,500 Jews, many of which he personally interrogated and tortured from his base of operations in the hotel terminus.
Quite another and far pleasanter side of the story of France comes from Lyon. Members of the FFI are seen marching off local collaborationists to the prefecture.
Following Germany's surrender in 1945, Barbie was found by the Americans. Despite him being listed as a wanted war criminal by the French government, he was not turned over to the authorities. Instead, Cold War politics would intervene.
And he ends up escaping justice, thanks to the help of the CIA, actually, and ends up in Bolivia. And there he remains, living a relatively unstressed life until the mid-1980s.
For 2 decades, Barbie advised the anti-communist Bolivian junta. On US instruction, he utilized his counterintelligence, interrogation and torture expertise for the dictatorship. The junta refused Barbie's extradition to France for years, until unrest brought about regime change.
Troops in the streets of La Paz. They're a familiar sight in Bolivia and proof of yet another violent coup d'etat. Bolivia's capital has been the center of nearly 200 military takeovers since the country became independent in 1825.
In 1980, Bolivia entered a period of extreme political crisis, as 2 years of protests, repeated military coups, and democratic reform destabilized the nation. Eventually, a socialist government took control, and Barbie's time on the run was up.
And he ends up being brought back to France, and he's tried in France in 1987.
Klaus Barbie emerges from 4 years solitary confinement behind the prison walls of Saint-Joseph to begin his trial. Driven at high speed through the streets where he fought the resistance, he began his appointment with justice by being backed unceremoniously through a side door of the courthouse.
May 1987. After decades on the run, Klaus Barbie would finally have to face a court and answer for his crimes. His trial was a major public event, made more so by the choice of Barbie's defense counsel.
Klaus Barbie had enlisted this defense lawyer named Jacques Vergès, who was somewhat of a notorious character.
I am fighting for the respect of truth. We have the right to know what really happened and not to be satisfied only with complacency and with lies.
Vergès would become infamous for defending indefensible clients, such as Slobodan Milosevic, Saddam Hussein, and he even said that he would have represented Hitler. At Barbie's trial, Vergès employed an unorthodox defense tactic.
And Vergès launched what he described as this trial of rupture. He didn't offer a conventional defense of the accused. He tried to indict the state of France itself.
Vergès argued that Barbie should be found not guilty on the basis that France itself was complicit in criminal behavior in their colonial holdings.
War is about winning. It's a total commitment. No Allied general was accused of any war crimes because after the war, they got rid of any such problems in their own way. There was injustice on both sides.
It seemed almost less designed to get an acquittal than to attract a lot of media attention. And I should say, it did attract a lot of media attention because he was this kind of very well-spoken character, and he was sort of a somewhat sinister character.
But the court was having none of it. Someone else's guilt does not absolve one from their own crimes. In Barbie's trial, the rupture defense failed. Barbie was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment. For the first time in history, French justice punished a perpetrator for crimes against humanity. To his dying day, Barbie was unrepentant for his crimes, saying, "I am proud to have been a commanding officer of the best military outfit in the Third Reich. And if I had to be born 1,000 times again, I would be 1,000 times what I've been." In the end, it took 43 years for the butcher of Lyon to have his day in court. 43 years of justice being sidestepped by cold political pragmatism and the high-minded ideals championed at Nuremberg being compromised. But Barbie's story shows us that despite the passage of time, the spark that was lit in Nuremberg had not been extinguished. In the decades after the war, hundreds more war criminals would be brought to trial. Amidst political machinations and Cold War tensions, the pursuit of justice would continue.